Your Excellency, Sheikha Al-Mayasa bint Hamid Al-Thani, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, students, and friends. Assalamu alaikum jami'an and good evening to all. My name is Hala Qamar and I am a senior at Georgetown University in Qatar. On behalf of my fellow students, the faculty, and the staff of GUQ, it is my distinct honor to welcome you to this 10th edition of the Hiwaraat conference series, Seeing Sudan Through Politics and Art. Before I introduce you to one of the most beloved faculty members at GUQ, I would like to share some important reminders. As conveners, Georgetown University facilitates dialogues like this one that begins tonight in line with our long-standing speech and expression policy. To that end, out of respect for our speakers, we kindly ask that no photos or videos be taken during the sessions. Only authorized staff are permitted to take still photos. Next, we want you to know that questions from the audience will be welcomed at the designated time. To submit a question, please scan the Al-Mirqab QR code, which is displayed on signs around the room and at the ballroom entrance. Please use the provided format to submit your questions. Finally, while participants are free to use the information shared in these discussions in public fora, out of respect for our speakers and to encourage open and honest dialogue, we ask that no attributable comments be disclosed. We also encourage you to visit the Sudan Retold book launch and art exhibition at Al-Hosh Gallery in the Pearl. It is curated by GUQ's artist-in-residence Khalid Albaih with Larissa Furman and Rahim Shaddad. Showcasing Sudanese intellectual and cultural richness, this project brings artistic expression into dialogue with space and memory. The gallery immerses visitors in Sudanese stories through photography, paintings, and multimedia. It will be open to visitors starting tomorrow for those of you who pre-registered and continues to the 28th if you are among those who have not yet registered for this oversubscribed event. And now it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Ruqayya Abu Sharaf, who is Professor of Anthropology at Georgetown University in Qatar. Her areas of expertise include human rights, migration, gender and diasporic studies, and political anthropology, with a geographic focus on Sudan, the Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. She is the author of several books and the founding editor of Monsoon, Journal of the Indian Ocean Rim. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruqayya Abu Sharaf.
Your Excellency, Sheikh Al-Mayasa bint Hamad Al-Thani, Sheikh Abdullah bin Ali Al-Thani, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, students, and friends, good evening. Thank you all for taking time from your demanding schedules to join us for the 10th edition of Hiwaraat, Seeing Sudan, Politics Through Art. I am grateful for Dean Safwan Masri's invitation to offer welcoming remarks. There is not a single Sudanese person on earth who has not been profoundly impacted by the war that shattered bodies, minds, and souls. Even as we speak, we witness yet another tragic development. A new parallel government has been announced by the Rapid Support Forces under Mohammed Hamdan Himeti, the very individual whose forces devastated Darfur two decades ago. The specter of further Sudanese partition following South Sudan's secession in 2011 looms ominously, threatening to unleash even greater horrors and destabilize regional peace and security. If this devastating war has exposed anything, it has revealed the truth that marginalization since independence has never been truly about ethnic differences alone. It has always been about elite dominance. Khartoum, the capital often portrayed as a pinnacle of privilege, reserved for a select few, has been stripped of its illusions. Today, the overwhelming majority of its residents share with their counterparts from west to east the same disregard for their inalienable rights to freedom from want and violence. Elite exploitation knows no boundaries. It devours all in its path, leaving ordinary Sudanese people, regardless of their origins, equally vulnerable to systemic cruelty and abandonment. Today, while our country's tragedy is recognized as the world's worst humanitarian crisis, media neglect persists, with the notable exception of Al Jazeera Mubashir's The Forgotten War, Al Harb al Mansiya, anchored by the formidable Ahmed Taha. It is no exaggeration to say that our desperate thirst for news about our homeland has led us to structure our very days around Ahmed Taha's broadcasts. We yearn for equal attention from international media, attention that would amplify the voices of innocent people who have already suffered far more than any human should endure. Our gathering this evening transcends the narrative of warring military generals and their supporters. Instead, it illuminates the significance of our country's aesthetic legacy, a legacy written in blood and resistance. Sudanese artists have chronicled the nation's anguish on canvas, transforming personal and collective trauma into powerful testimonies of survival. While some of you may have encountered Amir Noor or Ibrahim al-Salahi, masterworks at the Tate Modern in London or the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, it is al-Salahi's haunting collection called Prison Notebooks that reveals the reality of state terror unleashed against artists, intellectuals, and freedom fighters. Countless Sudanese artists have endured unspeakable violence in al-Bashir's ghost houses, those chambers of horror where creativity was met with torture and artistic expression was answered with systematic cruelty. It would be impossible to fully enumerate their immeasurable contributions to Sudan's political consciousness. Seeing Sudan this evening represents our effort to discuss the soul of a nation that had already topped the Fragile State Index long before the war of 2023. The reality is that Sudanese people have been locked in daily battles for survival for decades, and any prospects for even a semblance of normalcy have been systematically destroyed. As we listen to the presentations in Hiwaraat, we must hold this tragedy sacred in our hearts and minds, never allowing ourselves to forget, to understand the irony, and never permitting the world to look away. Here I must state the obvious. No single conference, however profound, can encompass the enormity of Sudan's anguish. Yet, we must leave no stone unturned to our quest to understand every form of resistance and every act of defiance that emerges from the chaos. It is my hope that each of you will not only enjoy this conference, but also to be engaged with it and transformed by it. Please feel free to exchange ideas with our participants and guests, think together, feel together, and heal together, even if only briefly. And of course, from the sorrow that haunts our every waking moment. Once again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. May Allah bestow infinite mercy upon those who have perished in the Sudan, grant swift recovery to the wounded, and guide us all to justice and peace. And now, to open this essential dialogue, it is my pleasure to introduce the Dean of Georgetown University in Qatar, Dean Safwan Masri. Thank you so much, Dean Masri, for caring. Dean Masri is a distinguished professor of the practice of Georgetown's School of Foreign Service in Washington. His mission to bring urgent global issues to focus here in Doha has earned us a place in the global imagination. The acclaimed Hiwaraat series is one expression of his vision, placing our community at the heart of debates that reverberate far beyond academia. Before joining Georgetown in October 2022, Dean Safwan Masri served as Executive Vice President of Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University. And he was a senior research scholar at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. He also held positions at Columbia Business School and the School of International and Public Affairs. He also taught and held positions at Stanford University and INSET. Okay. One of his most notable works is his 2017 book, Tunisia, an Arab Anomaly. Please join me in welcoming Dean Safwan Masri for his opening remarks. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ruqayya. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening, Your Excellency, Sheikh Al-Mayasa bin Hamad Al-Thani, Sheikh Abdullah bin Ali, Minister Gulwa Al-Khatir, distinguished guests, ambassadors, friends, colleagues. It's really, and students, it's really a pleasure to welcome you to Georgetown University in Qatar's latest edition of the Hiwaraat series, Seeing Sudan, Politics Through Art. Every war is fought twice, the novelist Viet Thanh Nguyen once wrote. The first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. Sudan today is tragically being fought on both fronts. Even reduced to its simplest telling, Sudan's recent history is staggering. I remember how in 2018, people across the political spectrum filled the streets with a defiant cry of freedom, peace, and justice. That revolution brought down Omar al-Bashir the following year, only for the promise of change to be throttled in its grip. And then, on April 15, 2023, came the rupture, when generals, drunk on their own uniforms, devoured their country and turned its cities into echo chambers of gunfire. Today, this devastation means 14 million people are displaced. Fathers wait for medicines that no longer exist. Refineries are collapsing into fiery ruins. Archives are shredded to build barricades. Wells are stuffed with decomposing bodies. And 17 million children are left without schools. The scale of this loss is overwhelming. And if it registers without breaking our hearts, then something vital in us has already gone numb. The war is being fought in memory too. Violence, by its very nature, assaults the stories through which a people know themselves. Tyrants grasp this by reptilian instinct, gagging poets, chaining cartoonists, exiling musicians. They know a poem can slip across borders like contraband, and that an image can outlive the very armies that sought to erase it. That is why, in 1937, at the height of the Spanish Civil War, Pablo Picasso painted Guernica after German bombs leveled a Basque town, a sight so unbearable that decades later the UN covered the tapestry during debates on the invasion of Iraq. That is why the Palestinian author Ghassan Kanafani was assassinated in Beirut in 1972, and cartoonist Naji Al-Ali in London in 1987. Their pens judged more dangerous than rifles. That is why Hind Rajab's last words in Gaza, تعالوا خدوني, Allah يخليك, رح تيجي, echoed into a film that this year it drew the longest standing ovation in the history of the Venice Film Festival, 23 minutes in total. That film will open the Doha Institute Film Festival later this year in November. Time and again, art bears witness to what politics seeks to deny. Even where politics once calcified divisions in South Africa, Northern Ireland, Rwanda, Bosnia, it was art in all its forms that smuggled in the possibility of coexistence. It reminded people that memory need not fossilize, that identity could be plural, and that life together could still be imagined even when suffered apart. The American sociologist John Paul Lederach called this the moral imagination, believing that the arc of history can bend beyond the present even when there is every reason to doubt it, and keeping alive the symbols and stories that remind the people who they are and who they might yet become. Across millennia, Sudan has given form to such imagination in ways both enduring and evolving. It rose with kingdoms along the Nile that rivaled their neighbors. It spoke in literature carried across caravan routes in Arabic, Nubian, and other tongues. It was preserved in Sufi manuscripts, in archaeological sites, and in the oral traditions of poets and praise singers. And it lives on the Sudanese writers, painters, performers, and documentarians, from whom you will hear at this conference. Those who bravely resist erasure even as the world looks away. They stand on the shoulders of Tayyib Saleh, Ibrahim Salhi, of giants whose work affirms art as the first witness, at once making sense of the present, relaying it to the world as it unfolds, and ultimately becoming a collective memoir entrusted to future generations. It is this conviction, that dialogue, that bridges past and future, that animates GUQ's pioneering Hiwaraat series. Conceived as a platform for high-stakes conversations, Hiwaraat has convened 9 editions since its launch, with topics including reimagining Palestine, the legacy of the Iraq invasion, Afghanistan's crossroads, and the future of energy and water. At a world-leading school of foreign service, art rightfully claims its place as one of the languages of diplomacy. That is why we teach culture and politics as a major at GUQ, and why we will soon introduce a minor in art, heritage, and cultural diplomacy. It is also why this conference finds its natural home not only at our university, but also in Doha, a cosmopolitan city long defined by the cultural richness of its diasporas. That we can host such dialogues is a testament to the vision of Qatar Foundation under the inspiring leadership of Her Highness Sheikha Mouza bint Nasser and Her Excellency Sheikha Hind bint Hamad Al Thani. We are honored by the presence today of Her Excellency Sheikh Al-Mayasa bint Hamad Al Thani, Chairperson of Qatar Museums. Her stewardship has affirmed art as a lingua franca of dialogue through initiatives such as the Years of Culture, Qatar's permanent pavilion in Venice, and the transformation of museums into spaces where local narratives engage the world. At Georgetown, engagement with the arts is an essential part of a liberal arts education. In recent years, this has included over 84 credit courses on topics as wide-ranging as Arab cinema, museums and statecraft, and Gulf futurism. This focus extends into initiatives such as hosting artists in residence, faculty-mentored research on the history of collections at Mathaf, and student experiential learning with archivists and curators. It also shapes the Hiwaraat series, first with Energy Cultures and now with Seeing Sudan. A personal highlight for me in this past year was collaborating with Their Excellency on an official student and faculty delegation from Qatar to the Venice Biennale, where they witnessed history in the making through the christening of Qatar's permanent pavilion. The opening exhibition, Beiti Beitak, My Home is Your Home, was centered on the themes of hospitality and community. At a time of increasing division, it is perhaps more critical than ever that cultural exchange be understood as integral to political dialogue. This war, now in its third year, has become a contest between meaning and meaninglessness, archive and erasure, memory and oblivion. Every act of creation is a refusal of the idea that Sudan can be reduced to rubble. And when we gather here, we add our refusal to theirs. Thank you for being with us tonight and for lending your conscience to this urgent conversation. May what we begin over these 3 days be its own promise. You can cut all the flowers, but you cannot keep spring from coming. Finally, I wish to recognize Zahra Babar and Dr. Suzy Mirgani of GUQ's Center for International and Regional Studies, whose dedication and inventive programming, together with Professor Ruqayya Abu Sharaf and Dr. Mu'izz Ali, shaped this conference. And I thank our Sudanese students, faculty, and staff whose courage enriches our community every day. In particular, our students Aya Ahmad and Noon al-Sharif. Aya and Noon, who have challenged us, sometimes by disagreeing, always by guiding us to where the conversations this conference most needed to hold. I also want to acknowledge the presence here of my close colleague, Dr. Amir Babich, Dean of Virginia Commonwealth University. With VCU, we have partnered and we will continue to partner on very important initiatives and conversations that bring art and politics together. Thank you, Amir. And thank you, Zena, also for your partnership. So, thank you. It is now my distinct pleasure to invite Zeinab Badawi, Nesrine Malik, Rashid Diab, and Khalid Albaih to take their seats on the stage with me so that we may launch into our opening panel, Eyes on Sudan. Welcome. It's a privilege to introduce what I know will be an exceptional conversation, one that speaks to the heart of so much that is unfolding around us. The story of Sudan is told almost entirely in the language of war, but to see only tragedy is to look with one eye closed. Eyes on Sudan is an invitation to open both eyes, to face the devastation and to glimpse the renewal that becomes possible when politics and culture are understood as one. Our panelists embody this spirit. they should all be very well known to all of you. Zeinab Badawi has given Africa's past a global stage and insists on telling its story on its own terms. Nesrine Malik, who will be joining us as a practitioner in residence this fall, or has already joined us as practitioner in residence, exposes the myths and silences that feed power and excuse neglect. Rashid Diab is one of Sudan's leading artists. I'm very proud, Rashid, to be the owner of 4 paintings done by you. And he has trained generations of artists at his art center. Khalid Albaih writes and draws to document oppression and amplify dissent. And Khalid has been an artist in residence at GEQ since the spring. Each of them will begin with a few minutes of opening reflections. Zeinab, let us begin with you, if we may.
Thank you very much indeed, Dean Al-Masri, and Your Excellencies Sheikh Al-Mayasa and Dr. Abdullah. It's very good to see you amongst everybody else, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends and fellow panelists. Very good to be with you in this beautiful city. First of all, I want to thank Georgetown University and indeed the entire community here, as well as the supporters in Qatar who have chosen this topic, Seeing Sudan, for this year's conference, because it is very easy to reduce Sudan to just a country where there is only conflict and huge, immense suffering, which, of course, undoubtedly there is. And as Professor Rohaya said, it has been very much neglected, ignored by the world. I don't believe that the world lacks the moral bandwidth to just focus on Gaza or other conflicts. We do have the ability to focus on enormous suffering wherever it is. And I and many other members of the Sudanese diaspora, wherever we are doing our best to see what we can do to act as advocates to bring about peace in Sudan or to help with the humanitarian efforts. I'm president of SOAS, and under the auspices of SOAS at London University, we've set up Humanitarian Action for Sudan, which tries to essentially do what it says on the tin, which is to try to bring humanitarian assistance to the people inside Sudan who are suffering terribly. But having said that, my focus in my brief introductory remarks, and of course, whatever questions you like to ask about the current situation in Sudan, I am sure the other panel members would be very happy to respond to those. But I just want to touch briefly on the history of Sudan, because it's politics through art, but I would also add history, because of course history is very much part of the arts and humanities. And to see how history not only explains our past, it also defines our present and also helps shape our future. And certainly you have seen that with Sudan. So as the Dean mentioned, I have written a book recently about the history of Africa, starting from the origins of humankind to the modern era, but focusing very much on that neglected history of Africa before the arrival
by an African,
of the European.
African history of Africa.
Thank you. That's the title. That's a very nice plug. Thank you, because I focus on African sources in my book, because, you know, so much of Africa's history has been written by outsiders, or it's been denigrated, or Africans have been told you don't have any history. But pertaining to Sudan, what I really just was very struck by when I was researching my chapter on ancient Sudan is how history cannot be consigned to the past. It is still very relevant today. And I just give one example. In that marvelous revolution in April 2019, when we saw civil society come together and overthrow the 30-year dictatorship of Umar al-Bashir, we saw very much that women were in the vanguard of this movement. And indeed, one of them, Hala Salah, became the kind of symbol of resistance. And the women who were in the vanguard of this protest, they styled themselves as kandakas. And you may have wondered, what is a kandaka? Well, of course, by then I knew that the Kandakas were the name given to the Queen Mother in the ancient kingdom of Kush. So Kush really existed in northern Sudan in its not its earliest iteration, but we know about it from very much from about 2500 BCE, before Common Era. So it coincided with the Old Kingdom in ancient Egypt. And then we had a later iteration from about 1450 BCE until about 690 BCE. And then we had its third iteration at Meroe from about 690 BCE until about the 4th century Common Era. So in the two later stages of the Kingdom of Kush, we had the Kandakas, and these were very powerful women. They could rule as co-regents with their husbands or with their sons. And in fact, one of them, known as Amani Shachito, in the 1st century BCE, fought alongside her son in battles. There was Queen Amani Renant, who was known as the one-eyed Kandaka, because she again fought against the Romans who were trying to invade Sudan, northern Sudan, after they had defeated Cleopatra in Egypt in 30 BCE. And of course, Egypt then became a Roman province. The northern Sudanese were having none of this, and they fought the Romans and forced them to sign a treaty in 22 BCE. And these Kandakas were, as I said, very powerful women in their own right. And the ancient Greeks mistakenly thought that Kandaka referred to a woman's name, and that's where you get the modern name Candace from. But actually, it was the title. And so these young women in April 2019 styled themselves as the Kandakas of the revolution, and they were very effective in helping bring about the end of Umar al-Bashir. So that shows you how history can't be consigned to the past, but it also shows you how, if you use the long lens of history, it shows you that Sudan isn't as it always was today. I mean, you don't even have to go that far back in 1885, when the forces of the Mahdi defeated the British, the Great Siege of Khartoum, when General Gordon, was defeated. And this was a victory not only for the Sudanese, but it was one that reverberated throughout the continent of Africa, and indeed stiffened the resolve of many Africans to try to, build up their nationalist movements and so on. So yes, today you can see Sudan as a byword for suffering and conflict and so on, but it wasn't always so. And in my book, I focus very much on the 8th century before Common Era, BCE, when the kings of Kush not only governed in an amazing civilization, which had temples and artifacts and all sorts of things, and built 1,000 pyramids. There are more pyramids in Sudan than anywhere else in the world. Only about 250 of that 1,000 have preserved their superstructure in some way. But they also defeated Egypt and governed it for the best part of a century. But they went beyond that. They were actually a regional superpower. They were protectors of the princes of Byblos, of Phoenicia in modern-day Lebanon. King Hezekiah of Jerusalem appealed to them to protect him against the marauding Assyrian army. So the ancient Sudanese were actually a regional superpower at a time when so much of the world was just languishing in a rather unadvanced state. You had this flourishing civilization. So it's worth remembering the lessons of history and saying that just because it is how it is today, it wasn't always the case. And history does inform the present, and it's just a very, very minor example, but it shows you how it's relevant today. The ancient Sudanese in the north of Sudan did not eat fish. They considered it an abomination to eat fish, perhaps because of its rotting qualities. So they had this Nile running through their land, the two Niles, the White Nile, the Blue Nile, the confluence in Khartoum. It becomes the Nile and goes into Egypt. But they didn't touch this amazing source of protein. And interestingly enough, actually, ancient Egyptian priests did not eat fish either. And to this day, the northern Sudanese, or the whole of Sudan actually, have one of the lowest consumption of fish in the world. It's about 1 kilogram per person per year, compared to Egypt, which is 25 kilograms on average per person per year. So it just shows you that what we think happened centuries and centuries ago still has some relevance today. And my final point to make is that looking at this terrible conflict between these warring parties, which is not really a civil war, it's between these two warring parties for power and resources, it is also a counter-revolutionary fight, which is trying to write out of the script those brave individuals, those Kandakas who came together in 2019 and overthrew a leader who people had had enough of. And so we must remember that those very people display the courage that was displayed on the battlefield all those centuries ago and, you know, in the 19th century against the British and so on. And they really do deserve our support. And they are the people actually who are now the bastion of those emergency response rooms, staying in the country, helping their fellow citizens by providing them with medicines and the emergency kitchens and so on. And so I think that we mustn't lose sight of the fact that this is also a counter-revolutionary war, and we cannot allow the forces who are trying to quell these marvelous individuals to be victorious. So thank you.
Thank you, Zeinab. Thank you. Thank you, Zeinab. That's an incredibly informative and a beautiful contextualization of the present moment that we're in. So if you allow me, from one Kandika to another, perhaps, Nesrine, you can, take liberty at what you want to share in your opening remarks, but I think the audience will be quite interested in also hearing about the role of media, or the absence of media. And I think, in a recent Guardian piece, you argued that Sudan's revolt was ignored because it offered no narrative, just a good old-fashioned uprising in a dusty Saharan country. More recently, this September, actually, The Atlantic, I read Anne Applebaum's story, The War About Nothing. And I'd love to get your views on why is Sudan al-Harb al-Mansiya, the forgotten war? Why isn't the world paying attention the way that Sudan deserves?
Thank you, Dean Masri. Thank you to you, and thank you to Georgetown, and thank you to all the attendees here today. Assalamu alaikum. I'm Nesrine Malik. I'm a journalist, and I have spent a lot of time over the past few months thinking about this question of why this extremely tragic and calamitous war is not receiving proportionate attention. I would not say it is not receiving attention at all. There have been some great journalists, some of whom are in the room with us today. I believe Yusra Al-Bagher is here. There she is. Who's just come back from Darfur, and has put in an extraordinary shift over the past 2 years. I think genuinely without her, we would know so much less about what's happening in Sudan. And I think whatever little political engagement on the part of the international community that has happened has been triggered and spurred by Yustra's coverage and others as well. There are other Sudanese journalists too that have been doing great work, some who are still in Sudan. Hiba Morgan, there's a Jazeera, The Guardian as well. And so the work is there. It's about the scale and the proportionality of the attention and the mobilization. Before I go into that, I'd like to speak just very briefly about a thought I had flying in yesterday. So over the past couple of years, I was in Sudan a few days before the war started, and the most unusual thing, or the thing that still stays with me about the Sudan war that is extraordinary. All wars are extraordinary in their own ways. They're wars. But the war in Sudan was particularly precipitous. It happened so quickly. There are 3 statistics that I've been trying to verify. I haven't verified them, but I haven't refuted them as well. One is that it's the first war in contemporary history to start in the capital. Usually, wars encroach upon capitals, right? They encroach upon bureaucracies, civil society, NGOs, etc. Sudan, Khartoum was taken out first. That has profound implications of the kind of narratives that can come out of a war zone. The second thing is it's the largest looting of a city in contemporary history, if not in history, recorded history in general. The largest looting of a capital city. That also has implications on storytelling. It also has implications on how many people, how many institutions, how many resources there are in order to get the word out. And the third piece of trivia or data about the war is the speed. I think it was 48 hours, less than 48 hours from when hostilities started to the airport at Khartoum being bombed. To take out the main airport in a city, the main artery, within hours of a war starting is extremely unusual, and it's usually kind of the last step, right? It's one of the sort of last manifestations of complete unraveling. So the speed and the precipitous nature of how the war unraveled in Sudan, I think also plays a big part in how the story and the narrative and the account of the war has been also truncated. It kind of, the word was smothered in the throat before it could come out, if that makes sense, because things happened so quickly. And therefore, the challenge has been to think about not only what is the war in Sudan, but what is Sudan itself, right? I find that the speed with which it has happened, and the effacement and the erasure of cultural memories, of physical artifacts, of history, of art, the way it sort of became overridden, stolen, looted, scattered so quickly, meant that it's been difficult to hold on to the notion of Sudan in one's head. Sudan is a place, it's a physical place, it's a gathering of people. But the only place that I have been able to find it and hold on to it and give it shape in my head is through culture, through storytelling, through narrative, through music, through literature, through art. And in a way, it's been a sort of, for me personally, an acceleration of my middle age, because like the nostalgia hit very quickly. And you become this cliche, right? You become the stereotype of a person who's talking about a place that used to exist 20, 30 years ago, the way our parents used to talk. But it existed only 2 years ago, right? So the timelines as well are quite disorientating, right? And so I just wanted to give that context of when we talk about the forgotten war, we also need to understand and pause at the unusual nature of the war itself, and how it unraveled. That's the sort of contextual part of it. In terms of the forgotten aspect of it, the Sudan war is not forgotten. It's ignored. It's deliberately ignored. I think deliberately is maybe tautologist there. Everything is ignored on purpose. There are many reasons for that. Part of it is the contextual reason. Part of it is just straight up racism. There are expectations people have of African countries, and they are not high expectations. There are also presumptions and assumptions of what life is like before war. People, when they talk to me, particularly in the Western media about Sudan, they assume that before the war happened, Sudan was not a thriving, prosperous, peaceful, historicized place, and that Khartoum was not one of the most beautiful, established story city in Africa. The sense is that war happens to places in Africa that are already volatile and insecure, as opposed to extremely stable. So there is that kind of simplistic approach, which makes the war seem like not an aberration. And And the third aspect as well is it is a complex story as far as outsiders is concerned. For Sudanese, it's a very simple story. But for outsiders who need to have purchase on something very simple, who's the bad guy, who's the good guy, you can't tell them, but it's actually two bad guys, or one bad guy that's split into two, or one less bad guy than the other. Like, you've lost them by then, right? You've lost their attention. So there's the issue of the sort of simplicity of the narrative as well. And the last point, I won't go on further, but the last point is also the Sudan war exploded in a particularly unfortunate time in terms of geopolitics globally. There is a fracturing generally of global arrangements. The situations in the Middle East, the Trump administration, the war in Ukraine, it feels like the war happened in an already fractured, unstable and uncertain world. So there is in that sense of rootedness and moral certainty that people can engage with Sudan from, which they did in the past, in ways that are problematic, but at least there was that engagement. And finally, I would say that the ignoring or the lack of attention or the kind of constant rediscovering of the Sudan war, I find is quite curious. You know, people constantly talk about the Sudan war as if they've just realized that it's happening, is because there are expectations of Sudanese people, African people, and Arab people to conform to certain plot lines. And Sudan is not conforming to those plot lines. There's ethnic angles to it, there's tribal angles to it for sure, but there isn't a kind of David and Goliath quality to the war. I'll stop there because I'm sure we'll cover these topics in much more depth. But I was very keen to foreground two things. One is how this war has happened, and two, how, as the country has become effaced, the cultural aspect of it is extremely, extremely important to hold on to. Thank you.
Thank you, Nesrine. Thank you, Nesrine. And you've commented before about how post-colonial legacies determine sort of what gets paid attention to and what does not. And I just want to underscore something that you said about cultural production and memory, right? And you and I have had conversations, for example, about books published in the 1960s and 1970s in this part of the world through which you understand the rise of Arab nationalism and sort of that moment. And I cannot help but make a plug for an important event we're having at GUQ next week. I believe it's on the 24th. We will have Isabella Hamad, who's a young Palestinian author, in conversation with Kamila Shamsi, our writer in residence. And to me, nothing has been as powerful over the past 2 decades in connecting and engaging global audiences. Of course, this is before the Gaza war and genocide, than art in communicating the Palestinian plight. And Isabella is one great example of that, because through her book, The Parisian, about her great-grandfather, Midhat Kamal, you learn about Nablus, you learn about the culture, you learn about the heritage, probably much more effectively than you would through political speeches, if you will. We're going to turn to Rashid Diab, and the conversation with Rashid will take place in Arabic. We have simultaneous translation, and I think you have headphones available, so we'll give you a second to put your headphones on if you would like. أخ رشيد، يعني بتشرفنا بوجودك بكل معنى، ويعني دور الفن والثقافة طبعا في تاريخ السودان زي ما سمعنا من الأخت زينب، وبالحاضر تبع السودان شيء هام جدا. وحضرتك افتتحت معرض ومركز معارض عدة، ومركز الثقافي مركز رشيد دياب اللي أسسته بهدف القضاء على الأمية الثقافية والحفاظ على استمرارية زخم المشهد الفني في السودان. أنت اضطريت أنك ترحل عن يعني احكي لنا عن وضع المركز اليوم والدور اللي اتخذه المركز في تعليم أجيال أو على الأقل جيل من الفنانين السودانيين، وليش هذا الشيء القد مهم.
السلام عليكم.
عليكم السلام
والتحية لكم جميعا، وشكرا على حضوركم. اسم الشعب السوداني حييكم. الشعب السوداني اللي محتاج لأي مساندة، أي دعم، أي إحساس جميل. الشعب السوداني الآن موجود خارج السودان. أنا حقيقة كلامي يفترض يكون عن علاقة السياسة بالفن في السودان، وللأسف الكبير ما في علاقة ممكن نتكلم عنها. علاقة ضعيفة جدا. عمره ما كان الفن من أولويات السياسة السودانية. ما ترتب على هذا هو هذه الحرب. الحرب دي جاءت لأسباب متراكمة كثيرة جدا، منها عدم مواكبة العقل للتطور التاريخي والإنساني للشخصية السودانية. الشخصية السودانية عندها مشاكل كبيرة جدا. هي شخصية متناقضة مركبة في بلد فيه أكثر من 570 قبيلة. لم ننجح في إدارة التنوع الثقافي، وعدم النجاح في إدارة التنوع الثقافي في السودان يرجع لعدم وجود ثقافة عند السياسيين السودانيين، وهذا أمر قديم من قبل الاستغلال، وتأثيره واضح الآن فيما حدث أثناء الحرب. تفاصيل كثيرة جدا عن تغيرات غريبة في الشخصية السودانية. نفس الشخصية اللطيفة الرقيقة هي عبارة عن حيوان عنيف مقاتل وبربري. أنا حقيقة كنت في إسبانيا وأستاذ في جامعة كومبلوتنسي، وتقريبا أول أجنبي يشتغل يعني من غير أمريكا اللاتينية يشتغل في الجامعة وفي كلية الفنون بالذات. كانوا الطلبة والأساتذة وكل ما عرفوا في تلك الفترة يشهل السودان تماما أصلا، يعني ما بيعرفوا السودان وين ولا كيف. وأنا أحمل طاقة تاريخية جدا من الوعي يعني القديم في الحضارات السودانية كلها، وبتخيل أن السودان دولة معروفة ويجب أن تكون معروفة، لكن ما كان في حد بيعرفها. فحسيت إنه في تقييم لي أنا كفنان أو كأستاذ في الكلية، لكن ما في تقييم لبلدي، وهذا في حزة في نفسي كثير، لأنه أحترم محب بلدي جدا، وأعتقد أنه بلد تستحق أن يعني يكون عندها تقدير في العالم. فقررت أنه أرجع السودان عشان أقوم بدوري على الأقل، لأنه معظم التشكيلين السودانيين والفنانين السودانيين دائما يواجهوا هذه الحقيقة، حقيقة أن الدول تقدر أو تقيم برؤيها الفني، التطور الفني أو ثقافتها الفنية. تعرف الدول عن طريق الثقافة وعن طريق المعرفة لما تقدم للعالم. أي دولة تتحدث وتغيم أو تندلع فيها حروب وعدم استقرار وعدم تنظيم وعدم إدارة تصبح دولة ما عندها قيمة أصلا، لأن ما قدرت تحافظ على وجود الحضاري، وجود الإنساني. من الأشياء اللي أنا كتبتها هنا، وأنا غالبا بدعب في العلاقة بين الورقة وبين راسي، لأنه أفتكر راسي فيه أشياء أهم من الورقة، لكن الورقة بتخلينا نتذكر الحاجة. فأنا أختصر الموضوع إنه حلمي بأنه نحقق يعني تطور ووقف على الأقل التلوث الثقافي الحاصل والجهل الغريب نحو أهمية الفنون في المجتمع. قمت بافتتاح جاليري كده شغال. أوكي طيب، افتتحت جاليري دار للفنون لتوثيق الفنون التشكيلية في السودان، وفعلا كانت جاليري احترافية الوحيدة في السودان. بعدها 2005 افتتحت مركز راشد دياب للفنون. هذا المجهود عملته لأنه كنت بحلم وأنا طفل صغير إنه يكون هناك الدوحة زي الدوحة دي، لكن دوحة للفنون والثقافة، بحيث إنه أنا كطفل صغير أجد مكان أذهب إليه، أو كفنان عندي رغبة في التغيير في المعرفة، أجد فيه الفن. لأنه لما كنت صغير ما كان في حاجة زي دي أصلا، فأنا حسيت بأنه لازم أقيم هذا المركز. عملت مركز راشد دياب، وعملت برامج متخصصة للوعي السوداني. هذا ما افتقدناه، ما لم يكن من أولويات التربية والتعليم في السودان. لم يكن هناك ولا زال برامج أو حصص أو مناهج تعنى بالعقلية السودانية ودور الفن في التغيير الاجتماعي من خلال ثقافة الفن. في حاجة مهمة جدا نحن لابد نطرحها لأنفسنا في كل يوم، وخاصة في السودان الذي بسببه حصلت الحرب. لم نحدد كيفية التعامل مع الأفراد والمجموعات عن طريق الحوار وعن طريق السلوك الحضاري. ده شيء مهم جدا. حتى الآن نحن نعاني من كيفية التفاوض والحوار والتوصل إلى العلاقات الإنسانية الجادة. نخاف من بعضنا نختار أسوأ السبل لمعرفة الآخر عن طريق المهم. مشاكل إنسانية كثيرة جدا نحن عانينا منها مدة طويلة جدا، وفي النهاية أدت إلى هذه الحرب. هذه الحرب لم تجي من لا شيء، جاءت من السودانيين نفسهم، وهذه حقيقة لابد أن نواجهها. نحن شعب يعيش على الماضي، مخدر بالماضي، مخدر بالتراث، مخدر بالتاريخ. نحن كنا ونحن كده، ودي شيء مهم جدا. لكن ماذا عملنا الآن؟ ماذا حضرنا؟ ماذا عدينا للمستقبل؟ الشيء الآخر مهم جدا وأنا دائما بذكره، إنه دراسة الفنون، تعليم الفنون وتعليم الفلسفة وتعليم الثقافة وتعليم الحضارة وكيفية وصول الحضارة، تحول الثقافة إلى حضارة، ده شيء مهم جدا لتعليم وإرساخ قاعدة التحليل والتدقيق والاهتمام عند الشخصية السودانية. نحن تعانينا معاناة كبيرة جدا في إتقان العمل، في احترام الزمن، في احترام الآخر، في احترام القبائل المختلفة، في وضع خطة واضحة جدا لتوحيد الشعب السوداني، حتى نتجنب مثل هذه اللحظات المؤلمة التي تحصل بين أفراد السودانيين بين السودانيين. كل ما يحدث في السودان يعني بشيء يدعو للخيل. أنا شخصيا بحس بنوع من الألم لما أشوف سوداني بيقتل في سودان وسوداني بيحارب في سودان، معناه في جهل، معناه في تخلف. فكان دوري إنه أنا أعمل المركز، وفعلا عملت المركز وعملت البرامج الثقافية الخاصة، وكنت بقيم كل يوم أحد، كل يوم أسبوع منتدى عن موضوع من المواضيع السودانية، على الأقل أدي دور. لو كل إنسان أدى دوره في المجتمع ما بيحصل هذا التفكك وهذا الضياع اللي هنا عشناه في السودان. أنا حقيقة سعيد جدا وأود أن أشكر جامعة جورج تاون على ما قدمته للسودان. فقط أنك تتذكر السودان أصبح شبه منبوذ. السودان أصبح شبه منبوذ، ولما ينبذ بلد معناه بينبذ أهل البلد. لا تفترضوا أنكم لا تعيشون هذا يعني الاضطهاد. أحسن كثيرا أن أقول للغة عربية شديدة، أحسن أقول بصراحة إنه نحن عانينا لأننا ما اهتممنا كأفراد بمصلحة الجماعة، اهتممنا كأفراد بمصلحتنا. وحتى الآن لا زال الفساد مستمر في السودان، ولا زالت أسباب الحرب قائمة، لذا لن تنتهي أبدا. والعالم لم يتعاطف معنا، لأن العالم يعرف مع من يتعاطف. عنده مؤسساته، عنده معاهده، عنده دراساته التي افتقدناها نحن في السودان. نحن ما عندنا دراسات واضحة للأشياء اللي بنعملها. دي مشكلة كبيرة. لم نحترم العلماء ولم نحترم الفنانين والمبدعين ولم نحترم أي شيء. مجموعة من الناس بتحكم في بلد يحتاج إنه نحكموا عليهم جميعا بالإعدام. معليش هذا الكلام، لكن خروجهم من الدائرة، خروجهم من الدائرة يتيحوا الفرصة للآخرين حتى يغيروا ما في السودان. السودان عنده ثروة بشرية هائلة، ثروات معدنية، عنده كل الثروات، يفتقد فقط لإدارة هذه الثروات وهذه العقول. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا أخ راشد. شكرا راشد. قبل ما انتقل Khalid, okay, now go back to English. Before I go back to Khalid, I'd like to remind audience members that you can submit questions by scanning the QR code that's available in various places around the periphery of this building and is also in your notebook. So please feel free to write any questions that you would like to address to any of our panelists. Khalid, you're a cartoonist and you have used the power. I mean, that's a fair. You're an artist, okay? You're an artist and you have, you're a cultural activist, and through your cartoon series, the Global Cartoon, right? You founded also Cartoon Mag, and you've come up with a new series more recently, Sudan Retold, and you've crowdsourced microgrants to, in your words, to foster the vitality and spirit of Sudanese artists. Please tell us how you have used art to communicate about Sudan and about the politics and the devastation in Sudan.
First of all, I'm very happy to be here. Again, thank you very much for including me in this incredible panel. And I'm still in shock that I'm actually here. But I'm also very honored to be here in front of people that supported me, of course, like Sheikh Mayaza, Sheikh Abdullah. And this is an incredible opportunity to talk about Sudan and to see so many friends that we haven't seen each other since this war broke out. And this is very important because we're talking about art. We're not only talking about politics. And just like we all mentioned here, the importance of art in society and the importance of knowing our history and the importance of just caring about and supporting artists. And this is something that I grew up here with in Doha, and I worked with. I was a part of seeing that happen and seeing that development happen in Doha. And this is, most of my ideas actually come from knowing how much of a change that makes in society, because I've lived it here. And it started, of course, as me as a young child here in Doha, and in the diaspora. And I was in class with, 20 nationalities. And this is the most beautiful thing about Doha as well, is that, I had to reintroduce Sudan every time. And I was looking for things to reintroduce Sudan, not only for them, but also for me. I wanted to know more about Sudan, but there was basically nothing but things about war and famine and, the normal things that we see. There was nothing of the Sudan that we know, the Sudan that when we go back home, we see. The love, the family, the history, the oral history, the proudness, all of that. So it was very confusing for me. And how can we reflect on that? How can we show the world and show myself and build on that? And I try to do that the only way I know how to, with cartoons, with art, with comics. And that's when I think I started working on a comic book. It's one of my first projects, actually, to talk about the history of Sudan through the old history of my family, and to talk about the history of Sudan that's rarely talked about, and like this war, ignored, mostly from us as well in Sudan. And but then I actually read Nesrine Malik's article, Khartoum, the selfish city. And that really diverted the way I thought about doing this book or this idea of writing about Sudan. Because who's Sudan? I live in a totally different Sudan than the one that we see on TV, or the one that's, the war that was happening in Darfur, or the war that was happening in South Sudan. We lived in a very small circle, and we understood that this is it. This is Sudan. So I thought to myself, why not include other artists, and they can include other histories and maybe futures of Sudan as well. And then I was like, why only artists? Why only graphic artists? Why don't we include all creatives to do that? And this is where the idea of Sudan Retold was born. And with the help of Larissa, my co-editor, and Gota Khartoum, we created the first book, and it took 2 years to get the book together. And we launched the book in Beit al-Turath في Khartoum in 2019. 2019 was one of the most beautiful years that I think that I've seen Sudan, because it was just so hopeful after the photo of Bashir, and we had so much hope, and people were still in the street, and there was art was the first thing that actually exploded in Khartoum. And after this war now, I felt that it's time to actually still, and it's very important to keep telling that story of Sudan, of Sudans, and these different Sudans, and because we really need to know how can we live together, because as Dr. Rashid said, it's really, this is our problem. We don't know each other, and I think one of the things that happened in this war is that through these battlefields and these videos that we see every day on social media of those people that look like us are fighting each other, and is that I discovered names of towns and that I've never heard before in my life.
Oh.
I had no idea that and cultures and dancing and singing that I've never seen before. So that actually really cemented the idea of the importance of talking about history through the art. Like, even in this war, these soldiers were practicing art, were singing, were writing poetry, and it made me discover a whole other thing. So we worked together again with Larissa to try to document what happened during the revolution in a next book in Sudan Retold, but war was too soon. We didn't even get to celebrate our revolution. And we started talking to artists. We kind of regrouped again after the war, and after most people kind of found a place to settle, and we started talking again. And it was such hard conversations to have, to talk to an artist, to tell them to talk about history when they don't know how they're going to live tomorrow. But it was important, and a lot of them actually understood that, but a lot of them did not, and we lost so much content, and we lost so much art. We lost so much artists, so many artists, because they didn't believe in what they're doing anymore. They didn't believe that art can be part of this conversation. And again, just like Dr. Rashid said, because we grew up in a place in Sudan where art wasn't important.
Mm. It's that ignorance that Rashid was talking
Exactly.
about.
And they look at you when you say you're an artist. They look at you like you're crazy.
Yeah.
And so many of us. But this is something new happened now. Like when we say hi to each other now, they say hi, ya fannan. That never happened before. So now we're taking pride in what we do. And I think that's a very strong point.
Yep.
So we worked on the book, and with the help of Georgetown and with the Almas Art Foundation in England, and with the new co-editor, our friend Susie, of course. And we produced the new book, and inshallah is going to launch tomorrow with an exhibition in Al Hoj Gallery, with the help of Vanna Mavana, who's been incredible. So it's been quite a journey, but I'm very happy to see everybody.
Thank you, Khalid. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to ask each of you a quick question. I'm going to be a little bit selfish, and before I turn to the audience questions and ask you things that are on my mind, so I'll ask you to be, quick, within a minute, 2 minutes, perhaps, so that we can turn to the audience. So, Zainab, you spoke a lot about, narrating Africa's history on its own terms, right, through an African voice. And we mentioned the book, right, An African History of Africa, but you also did a 20-part series, I think, on African history for the BBC. Can we, and you presented in your opening remarks, the very strong, what sounded to me like a very strong sense of not only African identity, but Sudanese identity, right? By taking us through the history and providing that beautiful context. So can we talk about identity a little bit and talk about, if you can talk about sort of being British and Sudanese? I think I read somewhere or heard you say that you have the best of both worlds, right? And this is something I, Nesrine, others can identify with, right? Having hyphenated identities. I should speak for myself, right? But can you talk to that in terms of what avenues has it opened for you in terms of talking about Sudan and Africa more broadly? And how has it limited you at all? And where do the identity dimensions of being, quote unquote, Arab, quote unquote, Black, where does that fit into all of that, if you don't mind? Again, within the context of sort of Sudan.
All that in 2 minutes?
They must take as many minutes as you want. I have to say, by the way, just, I was like, I was so delighted when we put together this panel, and I said, Zeinab Badawi is one of the greatest interviewers on earth. How am I going to interview her? So,
First of all, not too many compound questions. But,
well, I'm an academic.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your question there. Identity, I think it's a very interesting question because I think I'm the only one on this panel who has never really lived in the Sudan because I left when I was 2 years of age.
Okay.
So I've never lived there. I've never spent more than a month there. So you would think I was really deracinated. But actually, I think it's made me realize that identity hasn't necessarily got to do with geographical space. So yes, I've never lived in Sudan, but that doesn't mean that I don't identify as somebody of Sudanese origin. And I've never really understood, although I respect those people who, if people say to them, where are you really from? If you say, oh, I'm British or whatever, you say, where are you really from? I never mind, really. I say I'm Scottish, but, no, it's just a joke. I'm very happy to say I was born in the Sudan, but I've lived in England all my life. And I think that, in my case, my identity was very much formed by my parents, my great love for my parents, who were both, great patriots of Sudan, although they've lived in England for, many, many years as well. So I think that identity does not mean that you need to actually, occupy that particular space. I think what it did give me is perhaps a first-hand experience of obviously being brought up in an Arabic-speaking household, although, as you can see, I had to use the headphones because my Arabic is not great. I'm very good at things like get me a cup of tea and so on, but when it's too sophisticated, it's a bit too hard for me. But nevertheless, I was brought up in an Arabic-speaking household, and I had a first-hand experience of, something out there. And I think that did inform my my subsequent, my life and my career, in the sense that I always felt that I had a foot in both camps. And so looking at it through the lens of Sudan today, when you, Nesrine, and the others were talking about the war in Sudan and trying to explain that to British audiences or Western audiences, I honestly have reached the conclusion that you have to appeal to people's enlightened self-interest. I really don't think the empathy card is necessarily going to get you very far, because clearly it hasn't. We've seen a retreat not only in the US but in the UK and many other European countries from altruism and humanitarian help. You know, we've all heard about the aid cuts which have happened, in so many countries. But I think, increasingly I say to people in Britain, look, if Sudan is allowed to continue to explode, because we need external help to stop the war, if Sudan explodes, it's going to make what happened in Somalia look like a picnic. Somalia is 17 million people. Sudan's nearly 50 million people. Sudan borders 7 countries and it's got the Red Sea coast. Somalia, just a couple of countries. And, it's in a tough neighborhood. It's got very unstable neighbors, Chad, where there's a great deal of instability and lots of arms and so on. There's an extremist element also in Sudan, which of course worries its neighbors in Egypt and, elsewhere. We know that in the past, Sudan has been a bit of a bastion for, extremist activities. We know that there are other players who may be inimical to Western interests who are coming in Sudan. March last year, the Russians have been speaking to the people in Sudan, the government in Sudan, Al-Burhan, about setting up a naval base, on the Red Sea. Iran's influence is increasing not only in Sudan, but also in other parts of Africa. So for geopolitical considerations, if countries like the US and the UK and the European countries are interested in seeing peace in Sudan, or at least, maintaining it as a relatively pro-Western country, they're going to have to do something about it. Migration. The vast majority of people going into Europe now are coming from Sudan. It's something like 9 out of 10 of the migrants crossing the Channel from France into Britain are from Sudan. So you have to appeal to people and say, look, actually, it's in your interest to do something about this, because I don't think that they will just act because, as Nesrine said, they're just going to think, oh, it's business as usual, Africans killing other Africans, Africans starving, because we know there are famine-like conditions which the UN has declared in large parts of Sudan. So, I think that's the way forward. And just very quickly, on this question of external influence in Sudan, I was very heartened relatively pleased to see that last week, on Friday, the 12th of September, that the Quad, that's the US, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, got together and announced that they had a kind of blueprint for Sudan. Now, that was very significant because it's the first time that 2 key external players, Egypt and the Emirates, have come together in unity and said, look, we think that this is what could happen in Sudan, because we know that the first 2 principles of getting peace in a warlike situation is the warring parties have got to be ready for peace. They're not. They still think there's a military solution. But the second principle, which is very important, is there must not be external spoilers. And there have been. I mean, not just the 2 I mentioned, but, there are many others, but these are 2 of the principal ones. So I think that amidst all the gloom and the pessimism, there is this sliver of hope from last Friday that the Quad, has got a blueprint together, which puts the civilians centre stage in any transition process. Of course, we know that the SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces, have said, we don't support it because it writes us out of the script in any transitional process. But at least, we can say that there is a step in the right direction, because you cannot do anything unless there's US engagement. And there seems to be, at least now, courtesy, partly because of Massad Boulos, Trump's in-law. The father-in-law of Tiffany Trump, of course, is an Egyptian Copt, speaks fluent Arabic, met with Al-Burhan in August, last month, brokered by the Qataris. And I think we should salute and thank the Qataris for their great efforts for their great efforts, not only, in trying to broker peace in Sudan, when there are so many other people who are working against peace, not only, in Gaza, but also in Sudan. And that was a very, very instrumental meeting, which actually didn't get a great deal of attention. So, yes, thank you to our Qatari brothers and sisters here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Zainab. So, Nesrine, I want to pick up from that, and I'm going to try to make my question not be compounded, at least not overtly.
Masterclass.
I'll make it simple, right? Do you agree with Zainab? Do you share that optimism and that hope? Because you've written about the outsiders, that poorer countries endure because outsiders fund them, while wars in poorer countries endure because outsiders fund them, while others turn a blind eye, creating conditions where atrocities and famine unfold unchecked. Can you talk about the negative role that regional actors have played? Do you see a shift? Do you have the same kind of optimism, or do you...
Early days. It only happened last Friday.
Yeah, And listen, we have to have hope, right? We've got to have hope.
Yeah. I'll answer the second. It was kind of a little bit of a compound question.
Probably a little bit of slack.
I'll ask the second bit first, which is the degree of involvement in the Sudan war. I think it's also very important, just to go back to my opening remarks about how unusual this war is, that it is extended, given life by external actors. On its own steam, under its own dynamics, my belief is that the war in Sudan would have run out of momentum a long time ago. It would have run out of resources, of funding, of weaponry. Sudan is not a wealthy country. It does not have the capacity to fund this kind of war, and it certainly does not have the capacity to have two armies fund this kind of war without external involvement, particularly the United Arab Emirates, when it comes to funding the RSF and giving them political and financial and military cover. This is a fueling of the war rather than just a support of the war. And so when we talk about, and I will try and keep it brief, when we talk about optimism or the future or how the war is going to be resolved, whether it's the Somalia scenario or the Libya scenario, or there's going to be a quick unraveling, what we miss when we talk about the expectations of how this can be resolved is that it is artificially extended. It is artificially propped up by external actors and external interests. And that's because Sudan is strategic, it is wealthy, it has a huge amount of resources, particularly gold, and a particularly crucial geopolitical position in Africa and on the Red Sea. And so my optimism to talk about optimism about Sudan, you are encompassing in that question optimism about other countries, right? I am not optimistic about other countries. I am not optimistic about nefarious actors using Sudanese people and their resources and their conflicts to either enrich themselves or put themselves in better positions geopolitically. Absolutely not. I'm not optimistic about that at all. If anything, that is expected of these countries, right? Particularly, like I said, the UAE. I think it's very important to name names. What I am optimistic about, or at least invested in, is our shared fate as Sudanese people, right? It's our understanding as Sudanese people that when the roof falls, it falls on all of us. And that for us to understand that there is no outcome for this war that's good. For external actors, there is, because they're not involved. It's not their bodies or their lives or their livelihoods or their safety on the line. But what I hope, and again, part of the reason why this penny perhaps does not drop is because it has happened so quickly. What I hope for, whether it's expected or not is a different question, but what I hope for is for there to be a realization that there is no good outcome. There is no scenario in which one party can prevail over the other party and rule over a prosperous, peaceful, thriving Sudan. And for you to be a victorious leader, for you to be a party that has successfully vanquished another, there needs to be something to win. And the winner at this point is going to sit on a heap of carcasses, right? On rubble, on destroyed infrastructure.
So if either wins, everyone loses.
Everyone loses, including the party who wins. And so I think when we talk about negotiations and peace treaties and peace talks, etc., the only thing I think is the kind of rational line, or what I hope for, is for people to understand and know there is no good end for anyone, and therefore pull back. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nesrine. Thank you. So in the interest of time and to give as many questions from the audience their due, and I'm not going to be able to get to all the questions, so forgive me in advance. أخ راشد بدي أعطيك سؤال من جزئين إذا بتسمح لي. أول واحد هو كيف الهوية السودانية اللي هي إفريقية، نوبية، عربية، مسلمة، وكمان يعني في عدة layers إلها، هذا كيف أثر تعدد الهويات في الهوية السودانية؟ كيف أثر على المجال الفني، أوكي، على الصورة الفنية؟ والسؤال الجزء الثاني، لما انجبرت أنك تترك السودان، تركت بيتك وتركت كمان المعهد، المؤسسة، وتركت مجموعة من أعمالك الفنية، كيف يؤثر على فنك الحالي الجديد في الحاضر وفي المستقبل كون اللي تركته وراءك؟ هل هذا يؤثر على ما تفعل به اليوم؟
شكرا، ده سؤال مهم جدا. في الميكروفون بس اشتغل شكله كويس. سامعين بيه؟ سامعين. ده سؤالين دين مهمات جدا. السؤال الأول طبعا يعني الهوية السودانية يتخدعنا فترة طويلة من الزمن، خاصة المفكرين والمثقفين وبتاع، بفكرة الهوية، إنه ليه السودان ما عنده هوية، وليه فرنسا ما بتزعل عن الهوية، أو ألمانيا هوية ألمانية وهوية، ليه في أفريقيا في بحث دقيق جدا عن هوية، بالذات في الدول المسمى دول العالم الثالث، يشغلونا بالفكرة دي ليه؟ ويتنوا في أسباب كثيرة جدا، منها إنه يخلوك في دوشة كده، في عدم تقدير للحالة اللي انت فيه، لأنه أصلا الإنسان ما بيخلق الهوية بتوجد في داخله، بتوجد في وجوده في البيئة بتاعته، دي جزء من هويته الأساسية، العناصر المكونة لوجوده. لكن في جانب مهم جدا هنا لاحظته خاصة في المعمار في السودان، معظم المعماريين السودانيين بيقولوا إنه ما في عمارة سودانية في التاريخ، يعني طبعا في عمارة في الحضارات القديمة، مروي وكده وكوش، لكن هسه ما في مبنى سوداني بالمعنى إنه في هوية في المبنى السوداني. هنا بتظهر الاختلاف، هنا بتظهر المشكلة الكبيرة جدا، إنه أي شيء في العالم ممكن يحصل إذا كان إنسان فكر في صناعته بعمله، فكر فيه. الفكر هو الأساس في وجود الهوية لأي شيء. حتى نفترض إنه أصلا ما في حاجة اسمها ثقافة قديمة ولا حضارة قديمة ولا إنسان وجد من جديد، لابد أن يكون عنده تفكير بتسخير الواقع بالفعل العملي اللي بيخلق منه ناتج. ودي مشكلة كبيرة جدا. نحن لابد أن نبدأ من مرحلة التفكير الجاد في التغيير للمفاهيم اللي نحن تعودنا عليها. ما ممكن أقول إنه أنا ما عندي هوية سودانية. الهوية السودانية ناس بتقول إنه العلاقة بين أفريقيا ولا أنا زي ما حصل في مدرسة الخرطوم، ودير أساتذتنا أسسوا مدرسة خرطوم الصالحي وشبرين وعثمان وقال كده، رجعوا للعناصر المكونة للثقافات دي ومزجوهم مع بعض وعملوا خلطة جديدة لتكوين مدرسة جديدة في العمل التشكيلي، في اللوحة التشكيلية. هذه موجودة أيضا في الغنى، موجودة في كل النشاطات الإنسانية الأخرى، لكن هوية محددة لبلد محدد ما موجودة، لأنه قبل ما تكون في هوية بتكون في ما يسمى بالأمة مجموعة القبائل، مجموعة العناصر الناس الموجودة في المنطقة دي لابد أن يكونوا جسم واحد. الجسم الواحد ده بيؤدي لاتفاق. إذا كان ما في اتفاق معناه ما في جسم، ما يسمى اتحدت. لما تتفق مع بعض بتخلق ما يسمى بالدولة. مش الدولة بتخلق الأمة، الأمة بتخلق الدولة من وجود المتداخل أو البيع البيني من الجماعات المختلفة. أكثر من 570 قبيلة في السودان لا يمكن أن يتحدوا إلا إذا حصل نوع من الفكر المتحد، الفكر اللي بيطور عملية العلاقة بين الناس. عشان كده في صعوبة كبيرة جدا في ممارسة سياسة التنوع أو التعدد الثقافي في السودان. أدت لنتائج عكسية. ليس هي جمع ما يعمله هؤلاء الناس دي في القبائل دي عندهم أفكار وعندهم يعني علاقات قديمة جدا بالواقع بتاعهم، بالتراث بتاعهم، بحياتهم، لكن ما عندهم طريقة التفكير المشترك. وده أهم حاجة بنحتاجين لها نحن الآن في السودان. التفكير المشترك ده بينمى في الفرد من هو طفل صغير. كل واحد يفكر بصورة جادة في إنه يغير ويضيف ويحترم ذاته ويحترم الآخرين. نحن فقدنا هذه التربية. نحن ما مربونا ولا ادونا حتى حق في الحرية في إنه نتكلم عن أي شيء. كل شيء محصور، كل شيء معروف. السؤال الثاني وأنا سجلته لأنه بس طوال الأسئلة سجلته، هو يتكلم عن كيف أنا لما تركت السودان. أنا حتى الآن يعني عندي بعض الهلاوس وبعض الإحساس يعني مزعج جدا في تذكر ما حصل. كانت لحظات لا يمكن أن تساحة، وأنا سميتها الموت الأول. الموت الأول ده اللي هي الإنسان لما يموت بيترك كل شيء وراه، ما بيقدر يتحكم فيه بعد ذلك، لأنه بيقى للآخرين يرثوه ما يرثوه، لكن هو ما عنده قدرة على إنه يشير لأي شيء. الموت الأول ده عنده نتائج. يعني أنا لو ما كنت فنان تشكيلي وبديت أرسم من أول لحظة أنا وصلت مدريد. أنا أصلا كنت عايش في مدريد ورجعت لمدريد. من أول لحظة أنا بديت أرسم، برسم بصورة زي البكاء، زي الببكي. يعني مش برسم فقط، برسم بتعامل مع اللوحة ككائن يعني لازم يسيطر عليه حاجة، يعني إحساس متدفق من المشاعر والحاسيس وفقدان كل شيء. وكل مرة أتذكر واحدة من الحاجات العزيزة جدا بالنسبة لنفسي وأتألم أكتر. كل دقيقة أتألم أكتر كل ما أتذكر تفاصيل الشهادات، الجوائز، كده
كأنها من حياة سابقة. يعني
هي يعني بتذكر إنه أنا ما يعني ما عندي قدرة، أنا ميت، لأنه ما عندي قدرة أتحصل أو أمسكها أو أشوفها أو يعني أتحكم فيها. إحساس غريب جدا. وهذا الإحساس يعني لا يمكن أن نقول إلا في اللوحة. يعني مهما أتكلم ما هقدر أوضح كيف أنا كنت بحس إنه يعني حلقة كتاب بالنهار قبل ما انوم ابدا اقنع نفسي انا ما افكر. لما اصحى الصباح اول ما يتبادر لذهني واحده من الاشياء اللي انا عملتها او موجوده في المركز بتاعي او في البيت، في كده تجيني الاشياء تتحرك امامي وتعمل لي فيها يعني احساس بانه انا هنا وانت وين. يعني احساس عن الموت ده احساس غريب جدا. هذا الموت الاول يعني ادى لانتاج اعمال. كنت اصلا انا بديت قبل فتره طويله جدا ارسم حاجه لها علاقه بالتركيز اوت اوف فوكس، يعني اسمه الحاجه خارج التركيز، لانه شعرت انه الشعب السوداني كله في حيره. شعب عايش في ظروف غريبه جدا، وللاسف الشديد يعني كان مدعوم من جهات كثيره انه نحن كشعب ما في شعب زينا، وان الانسان السوداني ده بافهم زول واحسن زول وزول يعني حاجه كده ضخموا الذات السودانيه بحيث انه حصل لها اعتزاز بنفسها، بحيث انه اصبحت لا تتقبل النقد او لا تتقبل التغيير او تتقبل التنازل او اي شيء يصير يعني يدفع للتفاؤل. انا مش ضد فكره الانسان، يعني اخر ما يفقد الانسان هو التفاؤل، لكن لما رايته انا من نوعيه يعني من نوعيه من التفاعل الذاتي مع الاشياء اللي انا فقدتها. وانا ما بالنسبه لي يعني ده حاجه مهمه جدا، لكن ما تقارن بما فقدوه الاخرون من موت أبنائهم من اغتصاب، من هجر، من أشياء كثيرة جدا. عشان كده ركزت على موضوعين دائما في أعمالي، اللي هي الإنسان المحتار الضايع، مساحات كبيرة. هذا يتعلق بالمكان. المكان واحد من الأسباب الأساسية في مشاكل السودان، المكان اللانهائي الممتد، الأرض الكبيرة. الحاجة الثانية المرأة السودانية هي التي حافظت على السودان. أنا بقول بصراحة شديدة، المرأة السودانية عندها القدرة على النزوح لأماكن بعيدة جدا، تحمل بين يعني أطفالها، تحمل إحساسها بالحياة وعنادها على مقابلة الصعوبات وتربية الأبناء وتعليمهم. ويعني حاجة ما ممكن تتصورها، خاصة وأنا بشوفها دائما في حالة بتاعت يعني بذل مجهود خارق في ظروف صعبة جدا في السودان. وكمان من الناحية الجمالية اللي هي أنا بتهمني كثير جدا من ناحية اللون والشكل، حركة المرأة بالثوب بتاعها هي الشيء الوحيد المفرح والملون. أيوة، أنا بقدر أتكلم عن الجلابية البيضاء لأنه رخمة، لكن أفتكر إنه عندنا عيب كبير جدا، إنه نحن بحس إنه الوقار والاحترام باللبس الجلابية البيضاء والعمة ومكوية مرات كمان يغنوا لها. يعني الإحساس الغريب بتاع عدم التغيير والثبات في حالة واحدة مقرون بالأهمية تفرض هذا الزي. أنا حقيقة بفتكر الزي بتاعي هو صورة مصغرة أو علامة من علامات التغيير في الزي السوداني. لا بيحصل تغيير في السودان في كل شيء، كل شيء. من بديت إنه أخلق هذا الزي لأنه هو واسطة في تركيبة العناصر بتاعت الثقافات السودانية المختلفة، وجمعتها مع بعض وطلعت زي جديد مرتكز على ما يلبسوا أصلا السودانيين من جلابية أو على الله وكده. فده المنهج المفترض يتبع في خلق أي مؤسسة وأي موقع. لابد أن تكون هناك وحي ثقافي يعني يأثر في الشكل ويدينا الهوية بتاعتنا. شكرا جزيلا. شكرا.
Khalid, and I'm going to ask you to be I'm already getting stirs from some of my staff about running over time, but this is such an important and interesting conversation. I was going to ask a question, but now I'm going to turn to another one, which is because I'm being a little bit biased because it's coming from a new student, a first-year student, Bashair Al-Jumaili, who's Sudanese, and I've had the chance to start to get to know her. I'm quite impressed. The question she's asking you top everyone, but I'm going to ask it to you. What do you think in terms of outcomes of a conference like this? Is it mainly cultural and educational, or do you think conversations like this can have an impact on deliberations, on perhaps even policy conversations? What kind of impact can it have? And let me just editorialize by saying the cultural and the educational is so incredibly important, right? So if something like this doesn't accomplish anything beyond that, it's accomplished a lot. But can it accomplish anything beyond that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think just the power of having so many Sudanese artists and intellectuals and journalists in one place after this war is in itself a superpower that I think that will create so many conversations that I believe will lead to everything. This is our issue, just like Dr. Rashid said, we don't have a place we don't have a place to have a conversation. We're so polarized right now, so to have everyone sit together and talk and chat and actually see each other. There's people here that I know for decades, and some of them online, some of them I've never met before, but we know each other, we know each other's work and everything. So this is such an important get together in such a sensitive time. I mean, the first thing that happened when a lot of us met is just we hugged, because we miss this. We miss meeting. We miss just having a conversation, sitting down and discussing. in a place that comes from love. It doesn't come from hate for the other. No, how are we going to think about the future? How are we, as artists who rarely get a mic, rarely get a seat on the table, how are we going to sit here together, all of us, and do something? So I'm very sure a lot of things are going to happen from this.
Thank you. I mean, it is that shared community and a sense of solidarity, which Nesrine, you recall, and the Reimagining Palestine last year, we all felt that, right? Coming together. Absolutely. And you don't know what's going to come out of it. And that's the beauty of it, right? You don't know how that will impact the way that you think or actions that you take later on. Nesrine, you talked about shared fates. A couple of questions here deal with Darfur and what at least one of the audience members referred to as internal racism, right? How do you address that? I mean, so in addition to this huge conflict between two military powers, how do we come together? How do we get to the point where we understand that there's a shared fate that acknowledges sort of equality?
It's a great point. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you. It's a great point and a really important question.
I don't think the microphone is working.
Can you hear me? Now,
yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Great. I'll say it again. Great point. Very important. I think we already do. I think we are already there. In that it is very clear that what has been happening in Darfur and actually many other parts of the country for the past 40, 50 years, as some could argue even since independence, has finally cannibalized the rest of the country. I think that realization is there. And thank you for referencing the article about Khartoum from about 10 years ago, where it was clear that Khartoum had increasingly become a city barricaded against the rest of the country, right? Or a city besieging itself against the rest of the country. And so that understanding that our fate is shared, what you do with that understanding is the question, but we're there. Like it's very clear that what people thought was either not happening or exaggerated or could be contained is not. It's impossible to contain it, and in fact, it was happening, and it was way worse than you thought. And I spoke to a very stubborn family member the other day, of the kind of classic profile, older conspiracy theorist, who always thought that the Darfur crisis and the issue of racism in Sudan and ethnic prejudice was exaggerated, and it was actually about resources or about political rebellion, which is also true. Finally say something which I thought was really chilling, which was, he said that he finally not only understood that our fate was shared and that the history of ignoring these issues is what caused the war. He said, it is a miracle it didn't happen earlier. It's a miracle it took so long, actually, for Sudan to finally crumble under its own contradictions, right? And for the country to finally reach some sort of terminal point where it has to reckon with marginalization, with exclusion, with lack of infrastructure, with profound equality and profound deracination and denationalization. People were treated as if they didn't even belong to the country, like they just lived there. So the question of shared fate now is, I think, if you don't understand that our fate is shared, then there's nothing more that can be said. But it's what we do with that understanding. And the way forward, these conversations talking about culture or art or history have to encompass everyone, have to encompass everyone's experiences, and have to be a seed for a country that does not thrive on the basis of extracting or exploiting or not distributing equally between people because they belong to different races or tribes or ethnicities or even classes. And so I am very hopeful that discourses around Sudan, whether they be discourses like this about art or culture, whether they be political discourses, have to constantly come back to the fact that, yes, this is a military conflict, but it has been seeded for years and years by our complacency, number one, and number two, by our inability to confront the fact that you cannot run a country, you cannot build a country at the expense of others. Ultimately, it will come back to the chickens will come back to roost, and this is where we are at the moment. So I'm very keen that our conversations constantly have that sort of framing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nesrine. Zeinab, I'm going to give you the last words and pick up from a note of hope and optimism, and perhaps agency, right? How do you see sort of, agency being claimed, being put to work, even starting with the crowd that's here, right? Not over the next couple of days only, but beyond. What role do we have? What can we do? And it's stunning, in preparing for tonight, and I found out that the largest, correct me if I'm wrong, the largest sort of Sudanese diaspora outside of Egypt is in Qatar. The second largest is in Qatar. And I'm happy to see Abdul Wahab Effendi, my friend and colleague who runs Doha Institute here. So we're surrounded by Sudanese who are all probably wondering the same thing. So rather than ask you about media and the role of media and so on and so forth, leave us with that moment, with that thought, please.
You mentioned agency. I think that, no solution will be durable in Sudan unless it's one which has been devised by the people themselves. And you need to put the Democrats center stage. I used to think that you could have, peace and stability first and then development and then democracy and human rights. But I think they have to all be pursued in tandem. I think as far as the majority Sudanese are concerned, and some of them are represented here, it's a plague on both your houses, to the Sudan Armed Forces and the RSF. And I think that any future that's worked out for Sudan has got to put the Democrats, the civilians, center stage and devise what kind of future there should be, and the transition should have them involved, because they've been rather excluded from some of the talks. And even the Quad talks that I mentioned had been criticized for not having the ordinary Sudanese involved. So I think it's very, very important that it's not something that's imposed by the outside, but you do need the good offices of people like the Americans, because they are the only people who can influence anybody, really, to try and find some kind of peaceful outcome, as I said, with the external players who are fueling the war, as Nesrine said. There's all kind of, very sophisticated military equipment that's being used, drones that have, a distance of 2,000 kilometers. We've seen strikes around El Gadaref quite recently, and we've seen both sides rearming and recruiting and so on. So they still believe that there's a military solution. The arms embargo on Darfur has to be observed. It isn't. And just the thing on Darfur, of course there is racism, internal racism in Sudan. You mentioned that for so long. Sudan's been dominated by its northern riverine elite, or its so-called Arab tribes, wherever they may be in the West and so on. And that's a problem which predates this conflict and has never been sorted out. The conflict hasn't caused every problem that exists now in the Sudan. There are things which have predated that, and I think that that's something that needs to be discussed. But I think, and most people agree, that the territorial integrity and unity of Sudan has to be preserved. And so you've got to have a proper representation of all the different, ethnicities at the table. So I think you've got to give that agency, but you've got to stop the men with guns as a first step. And actually, there is an urgent and pressing need to establish humanitarian corridors for the people who are, languishing, being raped and starving. As we know, 25 million people are, food insecure. Let's not forget that Darfur is the worst battleground because we've seen the siege of El Fasher, which has lasted for 500 days. People reduced to eating animal fodder. So it's bad across the country, but it is worse in Darfur because there's always been a micro conflict there that has been exacerbated, of course, by the conflict. So agency, yes, put the Sudanese center stage. There isn't really a civilian leadership that everybody agrees on. We have Samud, which means resilience in Arabic, which is the one that Abdullah Hamdok, the former prime minister, is involved in. And that seems to be the largest umbrella group for the civilians, but he's got questions to answer. Some people feel that, their proximity to the RSF in the past, following that meeting he had with Hemeti last year, was not a wise move. And so some people feel that he in particular is a bit tainted. I mean, I don't know, but we do need to nurture the civilian leadership where we can. Some of them are present here. You would hope that a gathering like this would stiffen their resolve. And yes, you have to be an optimist because even in writing my History of Africa book, I felt that I couldn't just provide a narrative. I also had to provide a history of hope. And I think that we must all be captains of hope.
That's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful note. And thank you. Thank you for all that you do. And thank you for advocating through your work.
Jazeelan.
Thank you so much.